Janjak and Freda go to the iron market. Janjak and Freda, allez marcher en fait, go to the market of iron. By Elizabeth Turnbull, illustrations by Mark Jones. So this story has Haitian Creole and English in the text, in memory of Joan Martineau, who loved the children of Haiti. And then it says it here in Haitian Creole. So you'll see that the blue text, which I'll be reading today, is English, and the purple is in Haitian Creole, which I am not going to attempt. I don't know enough about it to sound right. As the colorful tap-tap stopped in front of the red and green iron market in downtown Port-au-Prince, Janjak and his cousin Freda felt their eyes grow big with wonder. "Marraine, look," they exclaimed together, turning to their godmother, Mrs. Pierre. She was taking them on their very first adventure to the famous market. "It's so big," Janjak said. "It's so beautiful," Freda responded, looking at the clock tower and standing tall in front of them. "I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Pierre spotted a man selling frescoes near the entrance to the market. "The tap-tap ride was long and dusty," she said. "I think I know just what we need to refresh ourselves." Janjak followed his godmother's gaze. "Frescoes!" he exclaimed. The fresco man carefully shaved off the ice and packed it in little paper cones for the children. "What flavor of syrup do you want on top?" he asked them, smiling. "I'd like cherry, please," Freda said. "I'd like mint," Janjak responded. The honeybees buzzing around the bottles seemed to like all the flavors. When they entered the big hall, Janjak and Freda stood in amazement. The crowds of people reminded Janjak of the ants that would scurry about whenever he'd accidentally step on an anthill. The people seemed to swirl around in circles, carrying heavy bags and baskets on their heads and in their hands. This happened at the local market near Janjak and Freda's home, too, but never had they seen so many people in one place. Freda decided there were more people in this market than on the entire mountainside where she and Janjak lived. Mrs. Pierre walked with the children to a fruit vendor. On his table were mounds of yellow mangoes speckled with brown spots to say they were at their sweetest. There were also bunches of bananas, clusters of canapes, and piles of chirimoya and soursop. "Mrs. Joseph, these are my godchildren, Janjak and Freda," Mrs. Pierre said. "Bonjour," said Janjak and Freda, greeting Mr. Joseph in the way their mothers had taught them. "Bonjour, children," Mr. Joseph responded. "How are you today?" "Oh, we are very well," Janjak spoke up. "Marraine has brought us to see the iron market." "I have to meet with some of the marchands at the market," Mrs. Pierre said to Mr. Joseph. "While I'm speaking with the vendors, would you be able to keep an eye on Janjak and Freda, please?" Then Mrs. Pierre added, "They will be very good and mind their manners, won't you, children?" "Yes, Marraine, we promise," Freda answered. Janjak nodded in agreement. Mr. Joseph smiled and said that of course he would like to help. As Mrs. Pierre walked away into the big crowd of people, Janjak and Freda felt a little curious about all the things she would see. They silently wished they could see too. "I have to meet with some of the marchands at the market. While I'm speaking with the vendors," marchands means vendors in the marketplace. "Do you like canapes?" Mr. Joseph asked, holding a cluster of the plump green fruits. "Oh, yes," Janjak said eagerly. He could feel his mouth water at the thought of popping open the thick green skins and chewing off the tart orange flesh. Canapes were one of his favorite treats. "We don't have any money to buy them," Freda said. "As our elders say," Mr. Joseph responded, breaking off a generous cluster of canapes for each child, "he who doesn't eat alone never knows hunger." Janjak and Freda quietly ate their canapes, taking in the busy movements of the marchands. In long rows up and down the aisles, the vendors had set up their stalls of goods to sell. The children could hear the adults bargaining with the vendors for the best price. Everyone sounded very serious, but Freda and Janjak knew it was more like a game between the grown-ups and the marchands. Mr. Joseph noticed how Freda and Janjak studied all the vendors. "Would you like to meet some of the other marchands?" he asked. "Do you think it would be okay?" Freda asked, looking at all the people. "Yes, go and enjoy yourselves," Mr. Joseph said. "But don't go too far. I promised Mrs. Pierre that I would keep my eye on you." Freda and Janjak leapt to their feet and walked eagerly down the long corridor. It felt as if everything they could imagine was right there in one aisle. There was a man selling brooms, buckets, and other items for the home. Then there was the artisan selling his beautiful carvings from old pieces of metal. At another stand, Janjak carefully studied the little cars made from old jugs, cans, and bottles. The toy vendor even had fancy toy cars and beautiful dolls brought in from other countries. What most caught Freda's eye was the clothing machine. Hanging side by side, the colors of the dresses looked like a rainbow stretching over the mountains after a strong rain. But what Freda really wanted to see were the stacks of pretty mouchoirs. Freda loved to wrap her head in her grandmother's scarves and pretend she was all grown up, heading off to the market on her own. Sitting on top of the stack of mouchoirs was a beautiful satin red scarf filled with a pattern of blue and pink paisley. How this would sparkle on her grandmother's head. "Grand's birthday is tomorrow," Freda whispered. Wouldn't she look so pretty in this scarf?" "Have you forgotten, Freda? We don't have any money to buy the scarf," Janjak said. "I know," Freda sighed, reaching out her hand to stroke the beautiful mouchoir. "I was just thinking." "Don't touch!" a gruff voice answered from behind the piles of clothing. "Children always have such sticky fingers, and they ruin my things." The clothing marchand gave a stern look to Freda and Janjak. Freda quickly pulled her hand back and kept it at her side. She hadn't done anything wrong, she thought. She was just going to take a closer look. "I'm sorry," Freda answered. "I didn't mean to be rude. I only wanted to—" Just then, a loud noise came from the entrance. Freda and Janjak could hear the baaing of the goat before they saw him turn and run down the aisle where they stood. The goat had a long rope trailing along the ground. Not far behind came a farmer, running after the goat. "Stop!" he shouted. "Come back!" The goat was most definitely not listening to the farmer. The farmer grabbed at the end of the rope, but the goat managed to sidestep quickly in another attempt to escape. As the goat jumped away from the farmer, he bumped the table across from the clothing vendor, spilling some of the rice, beans, and ground cornmeal that were for sale. The farmer slipped on the rice kernels, beans, and gritty cornmeal powder that would have made a delightful dish of mai moyen with bean sauce. As the farmer struggled to regain his balance, he pulled at some of the stacks of clothing, and they went toppling down with him. The goat saw his chance, zigzagging and running away again with the farmer close behind him. Janjak and Freda couldn't help but giggle at the silly scene. Nothing this exciting ever happened in the Laku where they lived. "Are you okay, Mrs. Jean?" Mr. Joseph had come over to help. The clothing vendor looked very flustered. "The goat stepped all over this dress," Mrs. Jean wailed. "How can I ever sell a dirty dress?" "It's okay, Mrs. Jean," Freda spoke up. "We will help you." "Help me?" Mrs. Jean responded, raising an eyebrow. "How can two children possibly help me?" But Freda had already left, pulling Janjak along. "What are you up to?" Janjak asked. He had seen that look on Freda's face before, and he knew that once his cousin made up her mind, there was no changing it. Freda walked over to the broom vendor and asked if she could please borrow a broom. Freda turned to Janjak and handed him the broom. "You can help sweep up the food that fell so more people don't slip like the farmer did," Freda said. "Now, if only I could help Mrs. Jean clean her dress." Janjak pointed out the soap vendor who was at the end of the corridor. "Why don't you go ask if we can have a little soap?" he said. Then Freda noticed the soap vendor also had a plastic bucket next to her. "I wonder if we can borrow her bucket," Freda thought. By the time Freda had returned with the plastic bucket, water, and a tiny piece of soap, Janjak had already swept up the rice, beans, and cornmeal. He was now helping Mrs. Jean with rearranging the stacks of clothing. Freda carefully picked up the pink dress and dabbed a little water on the dirty spot where the goat had trampled the fabric. Rubbing soap on the dirt, Freda began to wash the dress, just like her mother had taught her down by the stream where they would go on wash day. Back and forth, she gently worked the fabric until the dirt was all gone, and the dress looked like new. "Here, Mrs. Jean," Freda said, "your dress isn't dirty anymore, and now you can sell it." Then she added, "Well, you might want to wait for it to dry first." Mrs. Jean smiled broadly. "Thank you, child." Then she pursed her lips and asked, "Why did you want to go through so much trouble for an old lady like me? You don't even know me." Freda spoke up. "We didn't do it by ourselves. The broom vendor, soap vendor, and the man by the water pump all helped. It's like our marraine taught us. Many hands make light work." Mrs. Jean looked at Freda and Janjak. Why were you so interested in this red scarf earlier? Janjak answered shyly. Tomorrow is my grand's birthday, and we thought it would look pretty on her head. But we know we don't have any money to buy it. We were just looking. Mrs. Jean paused a moment and picked up the mouchoir. There's another saying from our elders. The spoon goes to the house of the bowl. The bowl must also go to the house of the spoon. We must help those who help us, she said. Take this to your grandmother and tell her that Mrs. Jean from the Iron Market says she should be very proud of her grandchildren. Freda jumped up and down. Really? She said. Merci. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Janjak replied, taking the mouchoir. Then he paused with a worried look on his face. We didn't help you so that you would give us the scarf. I think you should keep it so you can sell it. That, my child, Mrs. Jean said, is exactly why you must accept it. This is a gift to say thank you. Then she added, and perhaps to also say, I'm sorry. I should have spoken more kindly to you when you first approached me. Just then Mrs. Pierre returned. Have you been good, my children? She asked. Mrs. Joseph walked over and answered, They were a big help. You may bring your godchildren to visit any time you like, Mrs. Pierre. Yes, any time, Mrs. John echoed. As they took Mrs. Pierre by the hand, the children waved goodbye to their new friends. Apita, they shouted. See you later, the vendors responded. Ba rang out in the distance. And everyone laughed. The Iron Market of Haiti has a very special history. The market was built in the nation's capital, Port-au-Prince, in 1891. Since then, it has served a very important landmark and symbol for the Haitian people. But how it arrived in Haiti is to this day a great story in itself. The Iron Market was built in pieces in France in 1889. It was intended to go to Egypt to become the railway station in Cairo. The sale to Egypt did not go through, so Haiti's president, Florville Hippolyte, purchased it to help modernize Port-au-Prince. The market is known as Marché Hippolyte and as Marché en Bas, but more commonly and fondly as Marché en Fait. During the great earthquake of 2010, the Iron Market was badly damaged. The international community rallied to help save the market and rebuild it. The new market is stronger, resistant to hurricanes and earthquakes, and even has solar panels. And here's some of those words. Top. That's the little card. It means jitney. Marraine, godmother. Fresco, snow cone. Kenep, genep, some kind of fruit. Bonjour, good morning. Machan, vendor. Mouchoir, headscarf. Grand, grandmother. Mayimoule, cornmeal. Lacou, neighborhood. Merci, thank you. Apita, see you later. And here's the writer, Elizabeth Turnbull. And here's the illustrator, Mark Jones. Apita!